He thought his adopted son was taking him to a nursing home. The goodbye hugs had been stiff. The car was packed. But somewhere between the city exit and a detour into the woods, Frank Alden began to feel something was off, not just with the route, but with the silence in the car. When he finally asked why the road signs were in a language he couldn't recognize, his son gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What would you do if the one person you raised like your own suddenly made you question everything you thought was love? The morning had been unusually quiet, as if the walls of Frank Alden's modest home were preparing to absorb something unspeakable. The clock ticked louder than usual. The coffee tasted duller. The photograph of his late wife on the mantle stared at him with the same warm eyes she always had, but today they seemed to mourn something ahead of time. Lucas, his adopted son, arrived right on schedule, too punctual for Frank's comfort. The younger man wore an unreadable expression, his eyes hidden behind designer sunglasses despite the overcast sky. "Ready, Dad?" he asked, a slight tremble buried under the confident tone. Frank nodded, shoulders stooped more from emotional wear than age. He had raised Lucas as his own after taking him in from a broken foster system, gave up promotions to attend school events, and weathered teenage storms laced with rebellion and resentment. But now, here he was, being driven, supposedly, to a new facility, one Lucas had chosen himself. Frank didn't protest. Not aloud, at least. They drove in silence for over an hour. Frank watched buildings thin into trees and highway signs become sparse. The familiar route to Westbrook Senior Living wasn't this long, nor this desolate. "Thought Westbrook was closer," Frank finally muttered. Lucas's jaw tightened. "Took the scenic route," he replied. Frank let it slide. He didn't want to argue, but a sinking feeling took hold. Lucas had always been a mystery, loving but distant, dutiful but cold, as if afraid of becoming too close to a man who had chosen him instead of having him. When they passed a turnoff Frank recognized and didn't take, his suspicion crystallized into a silent panic. "You sure this is the right way?" he asked again, voice gravelly. Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the volume knob and turned the radio up, flooding the car with soft jazz Frank had never heard before. The silence had become a barricade. The road narrowed. Trees thickened. Cell service vanished. And when they pulled into a gas station tucked behind rusted signage and gravel, Frank noticed something odd in the trunk reflection of the store window. A folded top. A toolbox. A second duffel bag. All zipped tightly. His heart stuttered. Lucas walked into the store, leaving the keys in the ignition. That was mistake number one. Frank reached forward, fumbled open the glove compartment, and found nothing but a map marked with handwritten circles, none of which matched the location they were supposed to be heading to. When Lucas returned, there was a split second, a flicker in his eyes, where Frank swore he saw guilt, or was it regret? "Let's keep moving," Lucas said, brushing past the question he knew was coming. "It's almost time." Time for what? The phrase echoed in Frank's mind like a gunshot in a canyon. They were far from home, and Lucas's voice had shifted. Not violent. Not cruel. But final. The air in the car grew heavy, oppressive like a weighted blanket made of unresolved memories. Frank thought about faking chest pain. He thought about demanding answers. But the truth was, part of him still wanted to believe in his son. Still wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding. Until he saw the turnoff for Ridge Hollow, an abandoned logging route with no connection to any senior home, loom ahead. And Lucas didn't slow down. He turned in, calmly, like he had driven that road 100 times before. Frank didn't speak. His mouth was too dry, and his heart was too loud. All he could do was stare out the window as the trees swallowed them whole and wonder if this was the end. Not just of the drive, but of everything. The car rumbled steadily down the gravel road as the dense forest seemed to close in around them, but Frank's mind was no longer focused on the passing trees. It was slipping backward into memories buried under years of routine and restraint. He remembered the first day he met Lucas, a frail 8-year-old with a jagged scar above his eyebrow and eyes too old for his face. The adoption counselor had warned Frank that the boy had been through things he couldn't talk about, traumas that still lived under his skin like invisible bruises. But Frank hadn't cared. He was newly retired from the fire department, widowed, and desperate to fill the silence in his house with something other than grief. Lucas had barely spoken in those early days, but Frank remembered the first time the boy laughed, really laughed, when he set off the smoke alarm trying to make pancakes. That moment had felt like a small miracle, and Frank had sworn to protect that laughter at any cost. Raising Lucas hadn't been easy. The nightmares, the sudden outbursts, the tendency to hoard food in pillowcases, it was all part of a childhood lived on edge. But Frank never gave up. He learned to sit silently during the storms, to offer steadiness instead of lectures, to show up when it mattered most. School meetings, scraped knees, missed birthdays because Lucas refused to celebrate them. Frank endured it all without complaint. And even when Lucas hit his rebellious phase, storming out at 17 to live with a girlfriend Frank didn't approve of, he never stopped checking in. Never stopped leaving the porch light on, just in case. What Frank didn't say, and what he never would, was that adopting Lucas had saved him too. After his wife's death, he'd felt like a ghost in his own home. Lucas gave him purpose, gave him fight. But it had always been a lopsided exchange. Frank gave, and Lucas took. Not maliciously, not cruelly, but with the unconscious gravity of someone who'd never learned to believe love could stay. Even now, in the silence of the car, Frank could feel the emotional distance like a sheet of glass between them. Lucas had become successful, an executive in some high-end tech firm with a condo in the city and a car that practically drove itself. But every phone call felt like a business meeting, every visit like an obligation. And Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he was being phased out, slowly and quietly. His knees were weaker, his memory not as sharp, and Lucas had gently suggested assisted living more than once. Frank had always refused, insisting he could take care of himself. But the truth was creeping in like frost under the doorframe. He couldn't drive anymore, couldn't climb the stairs without resting halfway. And maybe Lucas was right. Maybe this trip really was for his benefit. Maybe Westbrook would be a soft landing. Still, something gnawed at him. It wasn't just the detour or the strange items in the trunk. It was the way Lucas hadn't asked him about the house before making arrangements. The way he had packed Frank's things while he was napping. The way he had avoided eye contact ever since they passed the city limits. Frank tried to shake off the paranoia, blaming it on old age or too many crime shows. But as the car dipped into a valley and the last bar of cell signal disappeared, he felt it again, that primal instinct he'd learned on the job, the one that told him when a burning floor was about to collapse or when a wall was about to cave in. Something wasn't right. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket, feeling the outline of the locket he wore around his neck, his wife's picture inside, a reminder of a time when life made sense. She would have known what to say, how to read Lucas's face, how to ask the right questions. Frank had always relied on her instincts, and without them, he felt like a man rowing in circles. Still, there had been moments, brief flashes, when Lucas had shown real love. The time he drove 4 hours in the middle of the night when Frank had a fall. The time he fixed the old radio just because Frank missed hearing the weather reports in the morning. But then there were other moments too. Sharp words. Missed calls. A strange coldness that sometimes surfaced without warning. As they crested another hill, Frank noticed something strange. A wooden sign, partially hidden behind tall grass, with the words "No access beyond this point without permission" scrawled in faded paint. Lucas didn't slow down. Frank felt his pulse quicken. "What's back there?" he asked quietly. Lucas didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road, jaw set like stone. Frank leaned back and stared out the window, hoping the landscape might give him a clue. But the trees were too thick, the terrain too foreign. His thoughts wandered again, to the late nights spent helping Lucas with math homework, to the silent dinners after teenage arguments, to the letter he wrote but never gave Lucas on his 18th birthday. A letter filled with words Frank had never said. "You were never a second choice. You were always my son." The silence in the car returned, heavy and unbearable. Frank wanted to believe there was still time to fix things, to say the words that had always gone unsaid. But the road was narrowing, and he feared they were running out of it, both literally and figuratively. In the side mirror, he caught a glimpse of the road behind them disappearing into fog. And suddenly, it wasn't just the fear of being abandoned that haunted him. It was the fear that maybe, just maybe, he had missed something all along. That this wasn't about a nursing home. That Lucas was carrying a burden he had never shared. And that Frank, for all his sacrifices, might have never truly understood the boy he called son. As the car jerked slightly over a series of potholes, Frank's knuckles whitened on the door handle, his breath short, not from exertion but from rising dread. The trees around them grew closer, like spectators pressing in on a silent performance. Lucas hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes, and Frank could feel the pressure building behind the quiet, like a kettle about to whistle. It wasn't just the road or the unfamiliar landmarks that set his instincts on edge, it was something deeper, something unnatural in his son's demeanor. Lucas had always been reserved, yes, but not detached, not this chillingly robotic. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic bounce of the tires were the only soundtrack to Frank's mounting suspicion. He leaned slightly forward, squinting through the windshield. Up ahead was a split in the road, one side paved, the other a narrow dirt trail leading deeper into the woods. Without hesitation, Lucas took the dirt path. The tires kicked up dust and pine needles, and the GPS unit, previously blank, flashed to life with an eerie chime. It displayed a single word, recalculating, followed by an unfamiliar waypoint labeled Ridgehaven. Frank's stomach turned. That wasn't the name of the nursing home they had agreed on. That wasn't any name he recognized. He turned to Lucas, his voice shaking. "Where the hell is Ridgehaven?" Lucas didn't flinch. "It's a private location," he said, too calmly. "Somewhere more peaceful. Less clinical." Frank narrowed his eyes. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why lie about Westbrook?" Lucas's hands tightened on the wheel. "Because you wouldn't have come if I had." That single sentence, spoken with sterile honesty, shattered what was left of Frank's sense of control. He felt like a passenger not just in the car, but in his own life. The silence that followed was suffocating. At the next stop, a crooked gas station with boarded-up windows and no visible clerk, Frank seized his chance. While Lucas pumped gas, Frank limped around the back of the vehicle and lifted the trunk, expecting to find luggage or a walker maybe, but what he saw left him cold. There was a shovel, a stack of blankets, several bottles of water, a first aid kit, and a worn canvas bag bulging with papers, cash, and what looked like legal documents. His fingers trembled as he pulled one out. It was a power of attorney form, already filled out, with his name printed neatly at the top and Lucas listed as the agent. The signature line was blank. Frank stepped back, heart thudding in his chest. This wasn't just a trip to a nursing home. This was a transition of power. A quiet erasure of his autonomy. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he returned to the passenger seat, eyes fixed straight ahead. When Lucas climbed back in, he looked over, sensing the shift. "You went through the trunk?" he asked, tone clipped. Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lucas sighed, placed both hands on the wheel, and for the first time in hours, looked directly at his father. "You weren't supposed to see that yet." Frank's jaw clenched. "What else am I not supposed to see?" Lucas didn't respond. He started the car and pulled away from the station, but something about his silence had changed. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was strategy. They drove another hour, deeper into terrain Frank didn't recognize. Civilization had disappeared, replaced by endless woods and winding hills. Eventually, Lucas pulled over on the side of a dirt trail flanked by thick trees. "Stretch your legs," he said. Frank didn't move. "I'm not getting out until you tell me where we're going." Lucas remained seated for a beat, then stepped out and walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door but didn't touch Frank. "It's not what you think," he said, softer now. "Just get some air, please." Reluctantly, Frank stepped out, the chill of the wind biting through his jacket. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt manufactured, like the world was holding its breath. He followed Lucas a few paces down the trail to a clearing with a dilapidated cabin at the center. Its windows were covered, its paint peeling like old skin. "This is where we're staying tonight," Lucas said. "I needed to talk to you without any distractions." Frank turned to him, eyes blazing. "You drag me out here, lie about where we're going, sneak around with legal forms in the trunk, and now you want to talk?" Lucas didn't raise his voice. I did what I had to do. Because you wouldn't listen. You never listened, not really. The accusation stung in a way Frank didn't expect. You think I did all this, raised you, protected you, sacrificed everything, so you could decide when I fade out of my own life. Lucas's mouth opened, then closed. He looked away. It's not about control. It's about survival. Frank stepped back, confusion rippling across his face. Whose survival? For a long, agonizing moment, Lucas didn't respond. Then he walked to the cabin, unlocked the door, and motioned for Frank to follow. There's something you need to see. Something I've never told you. And after that, if you still want me to take you home, I will. The sentence hung in the air like a trap, tempting and terrifying. Frank hesitated at the threshold, heart pounding. He didn't know what was inside that cabin, but he knew with absolute certainty that once he crossed that line, nothing between him and Lucas would ever be the same again. The moment Frank stepped into the cabin, he was hit with a wave of stale air and the unmistakable scent of old wood and forgotten memories. The floor creaked underfoot, every step punctuating the unease that had been mounting since the detour began. The inside was sparse, just a table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a bed pushed into the corner beneath a dust-covered window. A stack of firewood leaned against the wall, and next to it sat an old backpack that clearly hadn't been used in years. Lucas moved with strange familiarity, like someone returning to a place he had once called home, and that only added to the disorientation swirling in Frank's mind. He stood there stiffly, watching his son kneel beside the fireplace to light a flame, the flickering glow slowly spreading across the room like a spotlight on a stage neither of them wanted to be on. Frank didn't sit. He crossed his arms and remained near the door, ready to walk out if things didn't start making sense soon. Lucas didn't speak immediately. He moved with slow deliberation, pouring 2 glasses of water from a jug in the corner before sliding one toward the empty chair across from him. I used to come here with her, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My birth mother. Frank's chest tightened. That was a subject Lucas had never touched, not even when he was a boy. This place, Lucas continued, was our hiding spot. When things got bad at the group home, she'd sneak me out and we'd come here. She said no one could find us here. Not the state. Not the men who hurt her. Not even the past. Frank slowly lowered himself into the chair, his knees protesting, but his focus unwavering. You told me she was gone, he said. Lucas nodded. She is. But not how you think. There was something haunted in his son's eyes, something fragile that Frank hadn't seen since Lucas was a child waking from nightmares he never explained. She didn't overdose like the file said, Lucas said quietly. She didn't just disappear. She ran. She tried to take me with her, but they caught her, and they lied about what happened after that. She was arrested, institutionalized, and then, silenced. I didn't remember all of it until a few years ago. I started digging. That's when I found this place again. Frank's fingers curled around the edge of the table. Why didn't you tell me? Lucas laughed bitterly. Because I didn't think you'd believe me. Because I wasn't ready. And because you were part of the reason I had to bury it all. Frank recoiled as if slapped. What the hell does that mean? Lucas stood now, pacing slowly, like he was trying to keep something volatile inside from spilling out. You were good to me. You gave me a home. But you also wanted me to forget who I was. Every time I brought her up, you'd change the subject. Every time I asked about my past, you told me to focus on the future. And I did. I focused so hard I lost her. Lost myself. And I've been carrying that silence ever since. Frank tried to find the words, but none would come. He remembered those conversations, how he thought avoiding the pain would protect Lucas, how he believed he was doing the right thing by helping him look forward instead of back. But had he really helped? Or had he just rewritten Lucas's story in his own image? Lucas reached into the old backpack and pulled out a tattered composition notebook. He opened it to a page near the middle and handed it to Frank. Inside was a childish drawing of a woman and a boy holding hands in front of a cabin. She drew this the night before she vanished, Lucas said. I found it under a loose floorboard. Frank stared at the image, the crayon strokes shaky but filled with intent. Something inside him cracked, not just from the story but from the years of quiet assumptions and unspoken grief. "I didn't know," Frank said, voice raw. "I thought I was doing what was best." Lucas looked at him then, truly looked, and Frank saw the full weight of his son's burden in that gaze. "I'm not here to punish you," Lucas said. "I brought you here because I needed you to see this part of me. The part one buried to make room for the son you wanted. I needed to tell you what happened before I could move on." Frank nodded slowly, his throat too tight for words. The air in the room shifted, softened, but it wasn't relief, it was the heavy stillness that comes after a storm when the damage is still too new to assess. "And the papers?" Frank asked finally. Lucas looked down. "That's the other part," he said. "You're not well, Dad. I see it more each time I visit. You forget things. You stumble. You try to hide it, but I know. And I don't want to lose you without understanding you first. I needed this trip, for me, but also to decide what happens next." Frank closed his eyes for a moment, the fire casting shadows on his face. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in decades. "So, what do you want from me?" he asked. Lucas sat again, his voice gentler now. "I want the truth. All of it. Even the parts that hurt. And then we can decide together what comes next. Not with lies. Not with silence. But with honesty." Frank didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the unsigned power of attorney form, and set it on the table. "You'll get your signature," he said slowly. "But not until we finish this. Not until we're both seen." Lucas nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. "That's all I've ever wanted." And for the first time in years, they sat not as guardian and ward, not as aging father and wary son, but as two broken men in search of something whole. The morning light filtered weakly through the dusty cabin window, casting pale streaks on the warped wooden floorboards as Frank awoke in the creaky bed that had likely supported generations of forgotten dreams and broken promises. His back ached, his mouth dry, but it was the silence that roused him, the heavy, unnatural quiet of a place too far removed from the world. Lucas was gone. The chair where he'd sat the night before was empty, the fire had long since died to embers, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently with the wind. Panic surged through Frank's chest like a second heartbeat, but he forced himself to breathe. Maybe Lucas had just gone to fetch more firewood or check the perimeter. Still, instinct told him otherwise. He moved carefully, every joint reminding him of the years he had collected like rust, and stepped outside into the chilly morning air. The forest around the cabin seemed more alive in the light, birds chirping cautiously, leaves whispering secrets overhead, but the unease that had woven itself into Frank's bones hadn't gone anywhere. He followed a faint trail of footprints in the dew-covered ground, leading toward the back of the property where an old shed stood, leaning slightly as though burdened by the weight of its own history. The door was open. Inside, Lucas stood with his back to him, staring at something pinned to the wooden wall. Frank hesitated at the threshold, afraid of what he might find if he crossed it. "You shouldn't be walking around alone," Lucas said without turning. "You could fall." Frank grunted. "You shouldn't vanish before breakfast either." Lucas turned slowly, his face unreadable, but his eyes were different. Softer, red-rimmed, like a dam had cracked behind them. He motioned to the wall behind him. Frank stepped closer and saw a patchwork of photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings tacked up with old nails. Some were faded and curling at the corners, others pristine as if printed yesterday. In the center was a photo of a woman, her hair wild, her smile crooked, her arms wrapped around a much younger Lucas. "That's her," Lucas whispered. "That's the last picture ever taken before they took her away." Frank felt the breath catch in his throat. He recognized her. Not from memory, but from a single photograph he had once come across during the adoption process, one that had been deliberately excluded from the official file. "I found this place last year," Lucas continued. "I kept it from you because I didn't know how to explain what it meant. Not just to me, but to you too." Frank looked closer at the wall. Among the clippings were articles about a wrongful arrest, a cover-up at a group home, and a mental health facility that had quietly shut down after a whistleblower's death. "They buried her story," Lucas said. And I spent my life trying to forget it because I thought forgetting would let me be the son you wanted. But now I see that it only made me resent you." Frank swallowed hard, guilt rising like bile. "I never wanted you to forget her," he said. "I just didn't know how to compete with a ghost." Lucas shook his head. "You didn't have to compete. I just needed to know I was allowed to remember. And now I know. That's why I brought you here. Not to drop you off at a nursing home. Not to take your rights away. But to show you where I came from, where we come from." Frank staggered back a step, the weight of the misunderstanding hitting him like a tidal wave. "Then why the legal documents?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lucas exhaled, finally looking directly into his father's eyes. "Because the doctors called me 2 weeks ago. Your scan came back. Early-stage dementia. Maybe manageable. Maybe not. I didn't tell you because I wasn't ready. I needed you to be here, to understand everything, before we faced what's next." Frank's knees buckled slightly, and Lucas caught him before he fell, guiding him to a bench outside the shed. The world tilted beneath him, not just from the diagnosis, but from the sheer emotional whiplash of it all. He had spent days bracing for betrayal, and instead, he had been brought to the epicenter of his son's pain. Lucas sat beside him, their shoulders touching lightly. "I don't want to put you in a home," he said. "I want to build one, with you. Near the city. With caretakers. With me. But before I could ask you, I needed to make sure we weren't strangers anymore." Frank stared ahead at the cabin, the trees, the shed, the pieces of a past he had never been invited into. "I thought I was losing my son," he whispered. "Turns out I never really found him." Lucas's hand rested on his father's, firm and steady. "You found me the day you chose me. Now I'm choosing you." The wind stirred the trees, and for a moment, the forest felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Frank realized the destination hadn't been the cabin, or the nursing home, or even the truth. It had been understanding, long overdue, and painfully earned. The road back from the cabin felt different, not just in geography but in gravity, as if the weight they had both carried for so long had been released into the trees they left behind. Frank sat in the passenger seat, the unsigned power of attorney form now folded neatly in his coat pocket, not as a symbol of surrender but of shared trust. Lucas drove with one hand on the wheel and the other occasionally adjusting the heat, as if trying to keep them both comfortable in this new, delicate silence. But it wasn't the tense kind of silence that had filled the earlier ride, it was something gentler, a silence filled with reflection, forgiveness, and the echoes of things they had finally spoken aloud. The past no longer loomed like a threat between them. It simply existed, acknowledged but no longer feared. Still, for every truth they had voiced, there were fragments left unsaid, like pieces of a puzzle they'd agreed to accept without needing to fit together. When they reached the city limits, Frank could see the skyline hazed by winter sun, familiar yet distant after the surreal detour they'd taken into memory and meaning. Lucas didn't head to Frank's old house, nor to a facility. He steered toward a quiet residential neighborhood where a modest one-story home sat on a tree-lined street, its porch lights already on though the sun hadn't yet fully set. "This is it," Lucas said softly. "I bought it a few months ago. It's not big, but it's got space for a nurse if we ever need one. And you'd have your own room. Your own space. I'll be here too, for now. At least until we get our footing." Frank stared at the house, a mix of skepticism and awe etched across his face. He hadn't expected this. Not the depth of the gesture, not the permanence of the offer. "You planned all this?" he asked. Lucas gave a half-smile. "Not all of it. Some of it just happened along the way." They stepped inside, and Frank was immediately struck by the warmth, not just the heat from the central vents but the intention in every detail. There was a recliner by the window, a radio on the shelf tuned to the station Frank liked, even his favorite tea stacked in the cabinet. A photo of the two of them from a fishing trip a decade ago had been framed and placed above the mantle. It was subtle, but it screamed one undeniable truth. Lucas had been paying attention, even when Frank thought he hadn't. He moved slowly through the house, letting his fingers graze the backs of chairs and door frames, grounding himself in this new chapter. In the back room, the one Lucas had designated for him, There was a desk with writing paper and a pen already uncapped, as if waiting for a story to be told. Frank lingered there for a moment longer than he needed to. Later, they sat across from each other in the small kitchen, the kind of quiet now between them that didn't demand words. Frank sipped his tea while Lucas read from a letter he had found among his mother's belongings, a piece of her handwriting, a message of hope she had penned before her final disappearance. It was a goodbye, yes, but also a blessing. Be better than the world expects, she had written. And find someone who will choose you, even when you're hard to love. Lucas folded the letter and tucked it into his wallet without a word. She'd be proud of you, Frank said, his voice soft, weathered, but certain. Lucas didn't look up right away. His eyes shimmered under the kitchen light, and for the first time in years, he allowed them to stay damp without retreating into stoicism. I wasn't always proud of myself, he murmured. I pushed people away. I kept everything locked down. I thought love meant protecting, not involving. But I see now, you were trying to love me out loud. And I made you feel like it wasn't enough. Frank gave a slow nod, his grip tightening just slightly around Lucas's hand. We both made mistakes, he said. But I'd do it all over again. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. The confession hung in the air like a blessing, finally spoken, finally free. As the hours stretched on, the night wrapped around the house like a quiet blanket. They sat together watching a game show on mute, the hum of the dishwasher filling the space between them. Frank dozed off for a while, head tilted back in the chair, and Lucas covered him with a blanket without waking him. The younger man sat back down and watched his father sleep, his expression a mixture of regret and gratitude. So many years had passed them by, punctuated by small misunderstandings and long silences. But now, finally, there was no need for performance. Just presence. The truth hadn't healed everything, but it had stopped the bleeding. There was something honest in that, something sacred in choosing each other not because they had to, but because they still could. In the days that followed, their rhythm took shape like a song written without sheet music. Lucas made breakfast most mornings, and Frank insisted on washing the dishes even when his hands ached. They visited doctors, picked up prescriptions, and walked slowly through the neighborhood, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. Frank began writing in the journal on the desk, letters, memories, even confessions he'd never been brave enough to say aloud. Lucas found one, once, left open on accident, and after reading it, left a note in return tucked under Frank's mug. I hear you. And I'm still here. They didn't always agree. Old habits flared. But they fought differently now, not to win, but to understand. That change, subtle as it was, made all the difference. Still, not everything was fixed. Frank's memory lapses grew more frequent, and Lucas found himself repeating stories, reminding him of names, answering the same questions twice in one afternoon. But he did it without irritation, because now those repetitions felt like echoes of love, opportunities to show up again and again. And Frank, for his part, faced his decline with something close to peace, knowing he wouldn't be alone in it. He had once feared being placed somewhere sterile and unfamiliar, surrounded by strangers. Now, when those fears crept in, he reminded himself of the cabin, the shed, the fire, the photo wall. The pain had led somewhere. It had unearthed something neither of them knew they were still capable of, a new beginning. One quiet afternoon, Frank stood on the porch sipping tea, watching the wind ripple through the trees like a slow-moving tide. Lucas stepped beside him, handing him a sweater without saying a word. Frank slipped it on and smiled faintly. You know, he said, for a long time I thought love was about keeping the pain away. Lucas glanced at him, waiting. But it's not, Frank continued. It's about walking straight through it with someone. Not to save them, but to walk with them. Even if your knees hurt. Even if your heart does too. Lucas exhaled, the corners of his mouth turning up just slightly. Then I think we're finally getting it right. Frank nodded, eyes on the horizon. Yeah, me too. But there were still things left unsaid, pieces of the past too complicated to name, wounds that time might never fully close. There were questions Lucas never asked about Frank's reluctance to discuss his early trauma, and memories Frank would carry to his grave, out of protection or pride. It didn't matter. They didn't need to dig them all up. Not anymore. Some truths lived better in shared glances, in the way Lucas stood close when Frank grew unsteady, or how Frank squeezed his hand a little longer during evening prayers. The words might never come, but the meaning had settled into every part of their life. What they'd lost along the way had become the soil for what they were now growing. And while time was no longer on their side, understanding finally was. In that quiet, humble home, not everything was spoken, but everything was known.